It's Christian Aid Week, and for Christian Aid Week this year, we've been focusing on urban farming in Nairobi, which is quite an interesting concept, but it seems to be working and having a really brilliant effect. We're also looking today in our series on Jesus' parables at the parable of the Good Samaritan, which I'm sure you recognise when Pat read it to you. And I was struck by reading that parable by how different it is to some of the other parables we've been looking at, because I think it's really very clear what its meaning is. Henry commented when we started at the start of this series about how some of the parables are really quite obscure and don't seem to be very good teaching aids at all, because they had to be explained to nearly everyone, otherwise nobody had the faintest idea what Jesus was talking about. And as Henry explained at the time, there was a good reason for that, is that some of the things that Jesus had to say were going to rub up quite a lot of people the wrong way, and at that stage in his ministry it would have been very dangerous and very unwise to do that. But in this parable, I think there's absolutely no mistaking what Jesus is talking about. You've got this injured man, and you've got three people who come past, and the first two don't stop and help. They walk by on the other side of the road. They give him a wide berth. And they are the good and respectable religious people, the priest and the Levite. And they represent the good people, the holy people, people who would have been completely aware of what the Jewish law says about helping people in need. The Jewish law says that the Jews should walk in the ways of God, and one of the main attributes of God that is listed is his compassion. So to be compassionate is not an optional extra for a good Jew. It is central because it reflects the compassion of God. And those people, the priest and the Levite, the good people, would have been expected to comply with that law. And for them to break it by walking by on the other side of the road and failing to help someone in need was a shocking dereliction of duty, shall we say. Not what you would expect at all. And then there's the third bloke, a Samaritan. A person that no good Jew would have anything to do with. Even talking to a Samaritan would have rendered them ritually unclean and in need of purification, let alone being touched by a Samaritan, helped by a Samaritan, put on a Samaritan's donkey as a sort of ambulance. And that enmity was mutual. The Samaritan in the story pretty much had to be fictional, because no Samaritan, your average Samaritan at least, would no more go out of their way to help a Jew than a Jew would to help a Samaritan. So the point of the story, I think, is very clear, and it's pretty shocking. And the man to whom Jesus told this parable had actually asked him a question of clarification. In the context of Leviticus 19:18, which says, "You shall love your neighbour as you love yourself," he wanted Jesus to clarify, to define who was his neighbour, who he had to love, in other words. He was trying to put a practical limit on that commandment to love his neighbour. Because if he knew who his neighbour was, or just as importantly, who his neighbour wasn't, he could also, by implication, withhold his love from all those who weren't. And time and again in Jesus' encounters with people, we see him being really annoying, turning the question back on the questioner. Not answering the question, but asking a much deeper and more probing question. And one that questions the basis of assumptions on which the original question was based. And in this case, instead of telling the man who his neighbour was, giving him a nice, neat definition, he asked a question. He said, who acted like a neighbour to the person in need? And the man had to admit, it wasn't the good and holy people, it was that filthy Samaritan. And what Jesus was saying, in effect, was there is no definition of who and who is not my neighbour. There is no neat dividing line between those we are to love and those to whom we have no responsibility. What matters is whether we show love and compassion, not who we show it to. I think that we often try to do the same thing as that man. We try to draw boundaries between those we are willing to help and those to whom we feel no obligation because they are somehow undeserving or just different from us. On Monday morning, I was helping to staff the Christian Aid stall in town. And a man came up and asked what Christian Aid was about. And he looked at one of the leaflets on the table, which had a picture of the people in Kenya that we're focusing on. And he said, so, not helping any of ours. He didn't give us any money. Now, of course, the fact that Christian Aid supports development projects and emergency relief overseas, not in the UK, doesn't mean that the needs of people in the UK are somehow unimportant. But they're not Christian Aid's focus for all kinds of reasons. And the idea that charity begins at home, that we help our own first and others only with what is left, devalues the problems that poor people across the world face. And it also ignores the fact that many of those problems are sort of our fault in a way, that our affluent lifestyle here is built on the exploitation over centuries of people in the developing world, which is still going on today. And if only he had known it, the man I spoke to on Monday was drawing the same sort of lines between who is and who is not my neighbour as the man who asked the question of Jesus. And he missed the point in just the same way. Because in the kingdom of God, who we treat as our neighbour is relatively meaningless. But it means everything that we act as neighbours to as many people as we can. And it's also important to notice that we are to love our neighbours even if we don't particularly like them. It can't have been pleasant for the Samaritan to deal with someone who was covered in blood from the beating he'd received, with wounds that needed cleaning and binding before he could be taken to a place where he could be safe and recover. And in the same way, I'm sure we can all think of people who, for whatever reason, we find difficult to like. But Jesus still expects us to love them. And of course, there are limits to what you and I can do as individuals or even together. Because in Jesus' definition, our neighbours, the people we are supposed to love both in attitude and action, are everywhere. The problem is enormous. And it's easy to see the people close to us, our family, our friends, those who live near us, and how we can respond to them in love. But what about our neighbours who are further away, or whose needs are greater than we can ever adequately respond to? And that's where organisations like Christian Aid come in. Because by giving to Christian Aid, you and I can show our love to our neighbours on a global scale. Christian Aid and its partner organisations know people and communities across the world for whom a little bit of support makes a huge difference. That support might come as emergency help when a disaster strikes, such as an earthquake, a flood, a famine, or a war. Or it might take the form of a practical way of empowering people to make their lives better and more secure, such as urban farming in Nairobi. Frida, who we met in the video, and those like her, are not looking for handouts. They're not looking for an easy ride. They work incredibly hard to care for their families and to make ends meet. but the help they get through their partnership with Christian Aid at least makes it possible for their hard work to bear fruit. And the name of the local Christian organisation that's working with them is a fitting one: Beacon of Hope. Through their work, made possible by our donations to Christian Aid, hope is restored to people whose lives are harder than we can ever imagine. They are able to feed themselves and their families. They are able to send their children to school. They're able to sell their surplus produce and earn money for the little extras that we take for granted. And that's what happens when you and I and people like us act like neighbours to our brothers and sisters across the world. When we put our own hope into action by sharing hope with others. When we act like the Samaritan in the parable and show solidarity with those who need our help, rather than walking by on the other side of the road. Hope grows and the kingdom of God comes close.